Good morning, everyone. How are you? We're so delighted to see you. And we do have a louder microphone this week, so you can hear us a little better. So we're awfully delighted to be here. I feel like I'm out of breath from coming from the other side of the building, the other side of the campus. I feel sort of like a TV host saying this week on This Old House, because last week we did quite a bit. We only planned to do one lecture, and we ended up only getting about halfway through it when we were showing slides and starting to add a bit of things that weren't in our script. But where today, the way we're looking at this, you've had 4, 5, 6 weeks of music. You might be tired of music by now, but I mean, we really have said quite a bit about the music, and different people here have told you about the backgrounds of the hymns and the way things were structured. Our talk today may have a little more history in it than it does hymns, but I think that you'll still find it to be appropriately interesting. So just a really quick recap. Last week, we talked about how did we get here. Briefly, there was migration down the Great Wagon Road from Philadelphia, from Pennsylvania. There was migration east from the Hawfield area. There was migration up from the south, coming from Georgia and South Carolina. Did they have a plan? Not so much for a church. They had a plan to expand their lives and have property and have land that they could own and build their families. So, given that was the first step, and I won't say it was accidental. I don't know that you have to have a plan. Plans evolve as they grow. The second thing was relating the relocation of the Guilford Courthouse. When they cut the county up into pieces, Guilford Courthouse was no longer in the center of the county, so people down in Alamance had to travel 6 miles farther than the people on the other side, and they didn't think that was fair, so they petitioned the legislature to move the courthouse. They surveyed the county. They decided that the center of the county is literally right across the street between North Park and South Park. There's a big monument over there. And that was going to be the location of the city. Well, they got there, and the city was, that area was one big swamp with lots of marsh and lots of smells and lots of bugs. So they said, let's don't build a city. So they moved it up to the nearest high hill, which was about 6 blocks away up at Elm Street and Market. The next location, Father Paisley came to, the next accidental step, if you want to call it that, was Father Paisley moved here to Greensboro to run a boys' school over near, not too far from Landwood. And his intention at the time of coming here was to run that school. He did have qualifications. He was a certified preacher. He was registered with the presbytery. But it wasn't his original intention to come here to form a church. It just sort of occurred. And aren't we lucky that it did, because that little organization in 1824 suddenly grew into our lives. The last thing I have there is a new building, but I'm going to go ahead and advance this slide to show you this gentleman who you may or never heard of, or you may have seen his picture in the hallway on the doors. His name is Jesse Harper Lindsay. And he was a graduate of UNC. He gave a small plot of land over on Church Street to build our very first church building. Now, he was only 24 years old at the time. He was in the mercantile business and had established himself. He was part of a larger family that we probably don't know a great deal about. He had a sister, and his sister was named Anne Elizabeth Lindsay. But you might know her better by her last name. She was the wife of Governor Moorhead, who owned the Landwood property here in Greensboro. He was the 29th governor of this state. He served as 2 terms. He was best known as an education leader, but he was also known because he developed or helped raise money to form the North Carolina Railroad Company. Why is that important? To us as a church, not so much, but to the fact that this little tiny community of Greensboro suddenly became a distribution path for all the mills in the area. And that led to this huge growth here. And Moorhead was a member of this church. Governor Moorhead was not a member of the church, but he had his family all attended here. Interesting thing, and the reason I even bring it up, and there'll be another reference later, the only 2 things ever written down about the early church music here came from a young lady who was the daughter of John's brother, who was James Morgan. He was a lawyer and a city official, and he also eventually served in North Carolina House, the U.S. House of Representatives. His wife passed away, and his daughter, Annie, was literally adopted by the John Moorhead family, and she became one of the many sisters in that house. And she wrote a memoir that we cannot find the original copy of, but there are quotes of it in the book about Greensboro and also in John Simpson's book about First Presbytery. And he says that, he's quoting her as saying, when the progressives of the church made the suggestion that we ought to have a choir, many of the congregants were just horrified. They thought that was horrible. They didn't want to even go there. And they said, but she said that was nothing compared to the idea of when a pipe organ was suggested. And that was just scary to the people because the most they had ever had before was, I think you might have seen it on media this week, was an old string bass that was used to accompany what little choir there was at the time. So, long story longer, the church got its first organ in 1849, and that in itself was a bit of a miracle because the church couldn't pay for an organ. They did it by subscription. The ladies of the church formed the Greensboro Benevolence Society, and they were all helping raise money to build the building, and then later to purchase the organ. According to the records, the organ cost about $1,000. And in 1849, that was a lot of money. The history of Greensboro, written by Ethel Arnett Stevens, has a little story in there. It says that the organ was the very first organ in the corporate city of Greensboro, and it remained that way for 50 years before another church decided to put an organ in. So that made it kind of unique. Now and I just walked all the way through your script. I was supposed to share that up with her. That's
yellow thing.
The danger of letting me talk is not up to time. But here's the important question. So you have a church, a new building in the 1840s, and you have a new organ. Where in a small community of less than 900 people are you going to find an organist? In this little tiny community, we only had 130 members by this time. And so there were likely very few musicians in the town. They may have worked at some of the taverns that we talked about last week. But the real musical growth came as a result of Governor Moorhead. He had formed a school for young ladies. Now, he was a proponent of education, but he wanted women to have a chance to be educated too, but he might have had a selfish reason. He had $5. And he wanted them, he had a private teacher and a tutor in his house in the years before he formed the school. But he decided that it might benefit the whole area, so that he formed the Edgeworth Female Seminary. You may have seen the historical marker downtown near the YMCA. The school remained in effect. That was the building. And it wasn't just a small building. It was a 4-story brick building, and it contained, on average, 100 students per year were boarded there. Girls actually lived there. And we'll come to this later, but those 100 students frequently came to First Presbyterian Church on Sunday morning, which added to our overcrowded, tiny little building, but suddenly having 100 more persons to be there. It operated until 1868, when the Civil War just about shut down the whole area. Anyway, it was a very high-grade school, Presbyterian in principle, but not non-denominational. A newspaper ad in 1847 said that the school had a 10-month term, and it cost board and tuition was $150 a year. And if you wanted to add French or Italian, it was an additional $20. And if you wanted to put music on the menu for like guitar or piano or organ, singing was only it was an additional $10 to and this time I will let money happen. I'll just get right up on top of it.
Is this good
Yeah.
noise? Okay. Well, it's just noise. The first principal of Edgeworth was Mary Ann Hoyle, who'd been a former teacher to the daughters of Governor Moorhead. She was also a member of First Presbyterian Church. Around 1840, she hired Professor Heinrich Schneider of Germany as instructor in piano and organ and harp at the seminary. He was later hired after 1849 as organist of First Presbyterian Church. He trained the choir, developed a city glee club composed of young men and women of the community, and at one point in time, as many as 100 young girls from Edgeworth would come to First Pres on Sunday to worship and sing in the choir. Professor Snyder brought with him from Germany an established curriculum of music education, plus a broad exposure to European music. His programs and recitals at the Edgeworth Female Seminary featured quite advanced music, and he brought a new level of music culture that had not been seen before in the state, in North Carolina. We have a concert program. It's already up. We have a concert program. It's a little hard to read, but it shows some compositions that were very musically advanced. Now, I would not know anything about the level of advance of those pieces, but it's impressive that at that age and stage of the development of the community and music in the community that they were there. The development of the choir with an advanced repertoire paved the way for a very high level of musical performance here at First Pres. And that actually continues to this day, along with continued association with higher education. Lane, your turn.
I was going to let you go ahead in case you felt slighted by my
So were the students at the Moorhead School from all over the country?
They were all over the southeast. I don't have any particular information about the exact location, but it didn't mention anything from up north. It just said from the southeast region. It may have been larger, but there were national advertisements in newspapers that, and we actually have one of the newspaper ads from a Virginia newspaper. So there were quite a bit about it. Not much, you won't find much written about the Edgeworth School, except maybe a paragraph in a history book about Greensboro. But it was a fascinating school that you had 100 young ladies living together, and they had teachers and chaperones and the whole bit. But they managed to bring quite a few of them over here each week to the Church Street location.
Was it a pump organ where you're...
The first organ was a pump organ, and it was originally pumped by Professor Schneider. Later, they actually paid the custodian of the church to pump the organ, and I was wondering, how did they do that? I've never found a picture of that organ anywhere, but there was supposedly a crank on the side of the organ that would also fill the bellows with air, and that was what he was hired to do. And in it may have been a different organ then, but by 1906 or so, they had an electric motor to help fill the bellows. So it had its own evolution in a strange sort of way. You may have seen some of the pictures of the church. This is the picture of the second church. This was actually on Church Street, facing Church Street, as opposed to the backside that we normally face on Summit to see the frontages of the third building. But this building could seat 500 persons. And that was a little bit ambitious, considering that the membership was only a little over 100. But there were 100 students coming over, and there were frequently at any church a large number of visitors. Beyond the actual role of the membership of the church, there were quite a few people that showed up. And up until the Civil War, the girls, anywhere from 70 to 100 would come each week. I have no idea how they were transported. I'm sure they must have had wagons or something, because that was too far to walk from Edgeworth somewhere. But they would attend those services.
Lane, are we sure that is our church?
Yes. These are pictures that we had in our archive here in the building.
Because Terry Beaver said that one of our early churches, it was a picture, but it wasn't our church.
Right, that actually was a picture of the church at the home. Well, there was one at Buffalo that looked just like it, but the picture that we have on the walls here in the church that you may see around the building was actually the picture of Andrew Jackson's, what was the name of his home?
Hermitage.
The Hermitage, just outside of Nashville. And I didn't know this until Jerry mentioned it in a casual conversation. I went back and looked at the Hermitage website, and indeed, that is the picture. Okay. So all these years, I always thought it was a picture of something that represented our building. Now I know that it was even more so. One thing around this time, shortly after this, we had the first picture of our bell. You may have never seen the bell. It's up in the bell tower. We still have this same bell here. And it was presented by Elder Charles Yates. It has an inscription on the side of it that said, and in my silly youth, I climbed up into the bell tower. There's a ladder from the top of the bell tower that you have to literally hold on for dear life to get onto, because it's not meant for people to get into. And I won't do it now, I'm not sure. I was working for I digress too much. I was working for one of the radio stations, and we had a transmitter up in the bell tower to shoot the signal back to the radio station. And so I had a legitimate reason for climbing. It wasn't just vandalism. We climbed up, two of us climbed up into this tower, and it was quite a hair-raising experience. But we opened the trap door and got into another area and then opened another door. And I don't think anyone had been in that room in years other than to replace the rope on the bell. But it is a huge bell. It is not a tiny bell. It's about as tall as I am. And it has an inscription on the side of it. It says, "To call the fold to church, we chime. When joy or mirth are on the wing, we ring. When we lament a parting soul, we toll." Dedicated to the worship of the Master, presented by Charles Yates. The building, this was in the second building. It moved to the third building, which is now the Historical Museum, and then it moved here in 1928. The bell previous to that was actually taken and melted down for Civil War ordnance at one point. You may have heard that story earlier. Mr. Yates, who was an elder here, you might not know anything about, but he was married to the daughter of Reverend Peter Dube, who was the minister at West Market Methodist Church here in Greensboro. So the community was very tight and very well put together. The fourth building is the one that you might recommend. Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry, is that the bell that still,
That's the bell that still rings.
How about it?
It used to be pulled manually every week by the custodian at different times, and now it's on an automated system that you program it in, and it chimes at different times of the day. I think it's 6 o'clock in the evening, and then on Sunday mornings at 11, you hear it just before service. And it's still going strong. The third building here, except for the towers, which were taken down because they were not in good shape, that bulk of that building on the right side is still part of the Greensboro Historical Museum. The archway in the middle has been replaced with a continuous building to connect. And over on the far left is the Sunday school building. This building had room for 750 persons. That Sunday school building was added in 1903, I believe. And there's another picture that I'll come up to in just a moment. It stayed pretty much the same, but they ended up expanding the choir loft at some point. And this is a picture of the choir loft taken in 1923. These were brand new robes. They just got robes for the choir in 1923. And you can't tell it from this black and white picture, but the organ pipes behind the choir were painted bright orange and yellow. I only saw that in a brief paragraph mentioned inside one of the history books. It's only like one sentence, but I would have never known from looking at that. You can see one of the stone tablets behind the boys' choir, which is still extant in our tower room here at the church. That's been recovered. And that boys' choir was also brand new that year. Here's a picture from inside looking out at where people sat. The floor was raked on an angle. And there were, in the very back, you can see folding chairs that were in that back center section. There were pews in the front, but there were these folding chairs in the back. And it was a very substantial and beautiful building for what it was. The picture next up shows the interior of the Sunday school building. It has a very tall, high balcony around the upper side that would have been very, very scary to climb those steps because it had a very short rail on it. But you notice in the front, there's a grand piano. And that's not something you would expect to see in the Sunday school room. There was a time here when every Sunday school class had a piano, and everybody sang hymns before the service, before it began Sunday school. I think the only, if I'm not mistaken, the only class left doing that is still the young men's class. But there was a time when I was here in the mid-70s where we could go down the hall and hear 6 or 7 different Sunday school classes doing that. The Sunday schools, by the way, started back as early as 1833. We don't have any pictures from any of that. But even with the extra space, with the Sunday school building and the 700 and some odd seats in the sanctuary, they were still turning people away at the door at certain times of the year. Because Greensboro was a traveling city, we had so many visitors, and the church was very visible, and they used to advertise in all the hotels that you could come to church here, so people would show up, and it would be quite busy. I think that's it. Donnie, don't let you have it.
Okay. This third building, the Church Street building, is now, of course, the Greensboro History Museum, and they'll be celebrating an anniversary in January. And everyone encourages you to visit that museum and see some of the wonderful exhibits. And if weather allows, you can tour the historical cemetery on the property, which has always been a frustration for this church because we feel obliged to keep it properly tended. And that's hard for people to do. And some of the stones are falling apart, and as they would be. But if the weather allows during the time when the History Museum is going to be part of our work for this 200th anniversary, besides seeing the exhibits, you can tour the cemetery. It has over 300 graves, including Father Paisley, including Governor Moorhead, and members of his family, as well as many of Greensboro's early builders and leaders. Our current sanctuary on North Elm Street is our 4th building. Don't you love all those Model T Fords? And other early cars. When it became necessary to build a bigger sanctuary, the building committee determined that there wasn't enough space at the Church Street location, so other sites were considered, and our Fisher Park property became the choice. This is a rare photo of Fisher Park Circle prior to our building. There were 3 houses here. One was moved over to Elm Street, and the others were taken down to build the new building. The new building was designed by Hobart Upjohn, an American architect based in New York, who also designed Temple Emmanuel, Grace Methodist Church in Greensboro. One of the things that I find interesting about when Greensboro was young, it's amazing the quality of architects we had coming from other places to make this place an exceptional place. And you can drive around town if you know the history of who's where. It's really interesting who some of these people were. Rinaldo, for example, in Winston, was done by the same one who built a house on Country Club. It's fascinating. Upjohn's primary inspiration was that of the St. Cecile Cathedral, a 13th century landmark in Albi in southern France. And there is a picture of that, I think on the 2nd floor next to the elevator. And it's an interesting, you know that somehow or other we're connected to that when you see it.
We've been to the cathedral in Albi, and other than it being brick, we couldn't find much similarity.
Really?
Just the tall exterior and the tall stately fortress.
I must have a really vivid imagination.
I was showing a client around Greensboro one day, and he was from there. And I showed him our church and told him, that it was modeled after it. He said, "Oh, quite small, isn't it?"
So that makes you feel good. Greensboro architect and First Presbyterian elder Harry Barton collaborated on the construction of the new church. He designed 17 of the 30 buildings constructed in the 20s on what is now the UNCG campus, as well as the Guilford County Courthouse. He also built the Cone Export and Commission building next to the Carolina Theater, where choir member David McDonald has his law firm. So when you see David, if you don't know him, he's the tall bass in the back. The sanctuary was dedicated October the 6th, 1929. At the time it was built, it could seat 1,700 persons. But that number is slightly lower today after renovations, because in the last renovation, we widened the space between the pews, and that took up some of those spots. Speaking of renovations, here's a picture you don't see often. The entire sanctuary was empty, and scaffolding filled most of this great space while work was done from head to toe. This was taken in 2014. Right?
I was fascinated to see a completely empty room without pews, without walls, without flooring, and to see concrete. I've never climbed the scaffolding. At that age, I decided I'd done enough climbing, but it was still, there are 15 or 20 pictures about this, and I wish I'd put some more in the slideshow just to show you how they are. give you just a little bit, I've alluded to this, the fact that we kept growing and growing and growing, and sometimes we had a building that was maybe too big for what we had. But even with this new building that could seat somewhere around 1,700, we still had space issues. And just to give you a little perspective, here's a picture of Reverend Charlie Myers, who served for a very long time, 1916 at the old site to 1945 at the new site. When he came here, the membership was 983 persons. When he retired in 1945, it had moved from 963 up to 2,405 persons. Now, yes, he was a dynamic preacher, but it wasn't just him. The city itself had exploded in its population. The textile imports and the millwork and the commerce and the railroads had all created this huge growth of this little tiny village. Only 5 years after the time of Dr. Myers leaving, around 1950, the session first voted to have an early service to help accommodate the crowds, but more so to accommodate the parking, because there has never been a great deal of parking around Fisher Park. By the mid-1930s, the choir was growing. The church bulletins from those years said that we had 125 persons in our combined choirs, including the children's choirs. If you ever grew up in Greensboro, or if you had any history at all of Greensboro, the public schools had music specialists that went around to all the elementary schools. There were two ladies that I remember as a young child, Margaret Marsh and Crystal Bachtel, who were both involved heavily with the glee clubs, but they also were music specialists, and they would go to each of the elementary schools in town. We didn't have 91 schools in those days, we had a smaller number, but they would go around on a bi-weekly basis to each school and help tutor. I was looking through the church bulletins for information about how to put this speech together, and I saw Ms. Bachtel's name listed as the director of the boys' choir in a 1936 bulletin. And she was one of my elementary teachers at General Green School many years later. And I knew Margaret Marsh very well too. It was just interesting to find those names. Also, if you're I may have mentioned this earlier and don't remember, if you had any history of music in the schools in Greensboro, you would have heard of Herbert Hazelman. He was the band director at Grimsley High School for umpteen years. And was my band director when I was in high school there. And had been 30 or 40 years, I think, of his reign there, which was a positive thing. In one of the early bulletins here in 1935, I saw him listed as part of the First Presbyterian Orchestra, where he played English horn. Who knew? I mean, it's sort of interesting. I don't want to take too much time, I already have, but one of the that's sort of the history of how we got to this building and where we are. Everything pretty much here was internal. There was the outreach. There were other churches that were formed in South Greensboro and West Greensboro that were part of our growth. That's not part of my talk about music, but in general, one thing I can talk about was the fact that for the first time, things had started to change externally to our view. Was the fact that radio came along. Prior to 1926, there was no radio. There might have been a few record players. There were 78 records in that time. My mother has some that were from 1930. Had some from 1930, but I don't know how much farther out they were. Nonetheless, radio, Dr. Myers was intrigued by radio. He thought it was fascinating. It was a new toy, and it was a new experiment. It was only on a few hours a day in the evening. But he decided to exploit this idea, and he invited several people to get together with the Chamber of Commerce, and they would put our choir, or our quartet of singers, on the air on Sunday evenings, and sometimes broadcast our Sunday evening services on the radio station. And that exposed the community to a view of First Presbyterian that they would have never had they not been in the building. It was popular and caught on. Dr. Myers also went on to a few years later, make an arrangement with WVIG Radio, which was located at one time in the Jefferson Building, but later on it moved out on Battleground Avenue where Lowe's is now. And for 45 years, the station broadcast our Sunday morning services at 11:15. And the church did not have a budget to do that because buying radio time was expensive, so private individuals donated that money to keep that service on the air. And then later, some department stores, including Belk department stores, sponsored it for 15 or 20 years. So our outreach didn't have to come out of our own church budget, but it came through the generosity of other people. And that, in and of itself, was pretty remarkable.
First Presbyterian participated in other radio endeavors as a part of community outreach. In 2005, Reverend Sid Batts had discussions with Eric Albright and others about how to reach out to young adults in the community who might be looking for a church home. FM radio seemed like a wonderful vehicle. Sid recently recalled, quote, "Before we had this approved by the session, Eric and I visited a handful of members who we believe might be interested and capable of funding this ministry for a year. Morning radio advertising was very expensive, and we wanted our spots to run precisely between 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning, which we understood was when young adults were in their cars, either going to work or taking their kids to school." End quote. The radio broadcasts, 60 seconds in length, were designed not to be churchy, preachy, or moralistic. The primary mission was to get the church name out to young adults. Each 60-second message ended with the phrase, "Just a thought. I'm Sid Batts from First Presbyterian Church in downtown Greensboro." Some of you who've been here for a while may have remembered that. The radio messages continued up until 2015. Reverend Batts said, "On reflection, I believe that Just a Thought radio ministry was most effective. Eventually, First Presbyterian began to draw young adults, and our numerical growth was primarily through this group." Of course, it would be, because then they married and they had children, and that was nice. We'd always ask them how they got to FPC. Often we hear they knew us through the radio spots. What was interesting was after a few years, this is Lane's comment, after a few years he'd go into a pharmacy, a veterinary clinic, a doctor's office, a restaurant, and after speaking to an employee, he or she would look at me and ask, "Are you the guy on the radio?" It happened again and again, which was enough evidence for me that we were accomplishing our objective.
I'm going to shorten this down just a little bit because we're two verbose, I know. Another thing that really happened here that had a huge impact on this church, in part by intention and in part by accident, was the idea of streaming video. We put cameras in the sanctuary to record the services so that we could make DVDs and send them out to different places for people that couldn't be here in person. And then when it became a live issue, where we had actually streamed it live, it was even more interesting for folks to be able to tune in. If you had a computer, you could tune in. Little did we know that the streaming would play a huge part in the life of our church starting in March of 2020 when the pandemic hit and the building was closed to the public. We could not have congregants here in the building. It just wasn't safe. And fortunately, the technology allowed us to continue worshiping together. The ministers and the choir, section leaders would come out and do their service for an empty room, but it would be recorded and live streamed. Later on, several of the Sunday school classes did the same thing, the Agape class, the young men's class, even this class today is being live streamed for people that can't be here. That was a technology that didn't exist before, so it was a whole new way to reach people. Outreach is often hard to define. Sometimes word of mouth is the best outreach, but the fact that we had these opportunities were nothing short of a miracle.
I want to interject here. What one of our longtime ministers that you did not mention where radio was concerned was Dr. Redhead, because he was on the radio also.
National.
When he had, locally, of course, here he was on WBIG, as was Dr. Mullen. But Dr. Redhead had the distinction of being his presentations and his content were so above the average that he was chosen by the Protestant Hour to be a part of their national broadcast. And those were they were actually printed out on discs and mailed to radio stations around the country. And that was usually a Sunday morning or a Sunday afternoon broadcast. here in Greensboro, it aired on the local station prior to the service here. He was not there every week, but he was a regular, one of their regular, or performers is not the right word, speakers on the program. And his voice was very, very effective.
With newer and younger staff members coming aboard, discussions began in the early 2000s about a contemporary service. It took a few years in development before it actually was launched. Our contemporary worship service, Rejoice, which began in 2009, brought a new style of worship and a newer, eclectic style of music in worship. Guitars, bass guitars, violins, drums, piano, and other instruments have introduced a different style of worship experience to the congregants each week at the 9 o'clock service in the Life Center. Contemporary worship often contains a greater portion of congregational singing than in worship and less than in the traditional service, in a less formal setting. Matt Webb, the first director of music for Rejoice, remembers the beginnings of Rejoice. In late 2008, Dr. Robert Wells, whom I knew through my graduate studies, Lane's graduate studies at UNCG, approached him about helping FPC start a new non-traditional service. I've been working at Westminster as associate director for their contemporary music and had done a decent amount of non-traditional worship music in the past. After accepting the position in early 2009, began meeting with Dolly Hunt, Jacobs, and other staff to launch the service on January 25th, 2009. The service, called Rejoice, was held in the Family Life Center using live music and liturgy led by staff and ministers, and featured the same sermon that was heard in the sanctuary in the traditional worship service, which was live streamed to a large projection screen. At the very end of Rejoice, service minister who offered the sermon in the traditional service would join the Rejoice congregants for the benediction. It was non-traditional by the way of its more relaxed worship space, where there were coffee machines and places for families to spread out. It was also non-traditional in music, in that the style was not traditional or choral, though there was singing. The people who attended Rejoice found meaning and experiencing the music that they heard on the radio in the context of worship. The bread and butter of our music in Rejoice was traditional hymnody. After Matt left, the position went to James Keith, who'd been a colleague of Matt's in the DNA program at UNCG. James held the position for 11 years and developed a wonderful program. And in 2022, Will Edwards, a recent UNCG graduate, was selected as the new director of music for Rejoice and Discipleship Associate. He continues on bringing excellence in music each week. Lane?
There's one final image, just to say that our campaign theme this year for the church has been 200 years of blessings. I think we've been very abundantly blessed by some wonderful people, and we did not mention half. We didn't mention many of the ministers. I tried to keep more to the music, but I ended up sticking a few in there just for reference points. What those 200 years have meant is hard to describe. It's hard to describe what the next might bring as well. This final slide with Jill, we welcomed her, of course, in December of 2020 as our 12th senior minister and first female senior minister. She is extremely supportive of everything we do in music here and in all areas of worship, not just music. I don't mean to minimize it. She continues our church outreach with her weekly Thank God on Friday videos, the little clips you might see on Instagram or on Facebook. In so many ways, we're so fortunate to have her here. And if you ever see any musical event at this church, you will often see her sitting right there in the pew, and that is indeed a blessing. I could write a 20-minute program and talk for 40 minutes, and that's not a surprise to any of you who know me. But essentially, we'll wrap this up by saying that the music of First Presbyterian Church, the history of it is vast and deep, but not much of it was written down. As I said last week, they were too busy making history to write it down. There are very, very few mentions in the session notes about anything related to music, except some unusual things, which you might get to hear at a later time. The decisions that were made and the choices that were made by people of a particular time and a particular place. Those times changed frequently. As the years went by, the church grew and it improved, reformed, and always reforming. The music we have here now, organ, choral, handbells, guitars, drums, have all deepened our understanding of the connection to the spoken word and the written word. If you sing a hymn, you're praying twice as the whole sing, but it's still a good one. One quick note, as next week, if you, I think this class is invited to this, up in the Virginia Gilmer Room at 10:15, we're going to have a 30-minute Sunday school program about the musical instruments here at our church, about the organ, about the piano, about the harpsichord, about the handbells. Each of them have a fascinating history. It's just too long to go into. I wish we could have done that here, but if that's at 10:15, if you would like to come, you're more than welcome. Let me leave you with one final thought from the late Maya Angelou, and it is this, that life is not measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the number of moments that take our breath away. And I think that describes the music program at First Presbyterian in so many positive ways. Thank you all for so patiently listening to us. I know today wasn't so much about music, but about history. In the process of summarizing and minimizing, we left out so much. But I think you get a bigger understanding of just how vast and how expansive this history is. And it's largely unwritten until today. So, thank you for being here. Have a wonderful